Prince Adrian Van Cleese had never begged for anything in all his years. That changed the night he knelt in freezing rain outside Selina Metz's apartment, his pride drowning in the storm. The boardroom fell silent the moment Prince Adrian Van Cleese entered, his footsteps echoing against marble floors like the countdown to an execution. 23 executives rose in unison, their movements synchronized by years of protocol and fear. He didn't acknowledge them. He never did. Adrian moved to the head of the table with the fluid grace of someone who had been bred for power, his dark suit immaculate, his expression carved from ice. The quarterly review had been brutal. Numbers were dissected, departments dismantled with surgical precision, but it was the final item on the agenda that would haunt him, though he didn't know it yet. Richard Metz, senior accountant, 27 years of service. A miscalculation in the foreign exchange hedging report. Small, perhaps forgivable, but Adrian Van Cleese did not forgive. The prince's voice, when it came, was quiet. That made it worse. Volume would have been merciful. It would have suggested emotion. This was something colder. Incompetence, he said, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the trembling man across the table. Is not softened by loyalty. Terminate his contract. Effective immediately. Richard Metz aged a decade in that moment, his face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Someone, his supervisor perhaps, tried to interject, to mention extenuating circumstances. But Adrian's gaze shifted, and the words died unspoken. The meeting concluded. Chairs scraped, bodies fled. Adrian remained, reviewing documents he didn't see, his mind already calculating the next acquisition, the next merger. Sentiment was a luxury he'd abandoned in his teens, when his father had made it clear that princes who felt too much ruled too little. The lesson had taken root deep. It was 3 hours later when his secretary entered, her usual composure fractured. She'd been with him for 9 years and had weathered his coldness with professional detachment, but now her hands shook as she placed the phone on his desk. Your Highness, she whispered. Richard Metz collapsed. Heart complications. He's at Asterion General. For the first time in years, Adrian felt something crack beneath his ribcage. Not guilt, he wouldn't name it that. But something shifted, uncomfortable and unfamiliar, like a bone setting wrong. He dismissed her with a gesture and sat alone in the dimming office, the city lights beginning to sparkle beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Empires spread before him, power at his fingertips. And yet that crack widened, a fissure in the foundation of certainty he'd spent his life constructing. His secretary returned an hour later with another update. Richard was stable. The family had been contacted. The palace had offered financial compensation, as protocol demanded. There's one more thing, Your Highness. She hesitated, unusual for her. The daughter refused the compensation. Returned the check unopened. Her name is Selina Metz. Adrian's fingers poised over a contract, stilled. Selene. He rolled the name through his mind, testing its weight. The daughter who had said no to a prince. The woman who had dared refuse him when others bowed. That night, alone in his private study with rain streaking the windows, Adrian Van Cleese told himself he felt nothing. But her name circled his thoughts like a bird of prey, patient and relentless, waiting for the moment to strike. Adrian told himself the hospital visit was about protocol, about ensuring proper care for a former employee, about maintaining the palace's reputation for compassion. Even if that compassion was calculated and cold, he knew he was lying. Asterion General's private wing was a place he'd visited exactly twice, once for a diplomatic photo opportunity, once for a distant cousin's appendectomy. He moved through its corridors now with his usual controlled grace, 2 security officers maintaining a discreet distance, his presence causing nurses and patients alike to freeze and stare. Richard Metz's room was at the end of the hall. Adrian paused outside, straightening cuffs that didn't need straightening, aware that he was stalling and disgusted by his own hesitation. Then he heard her voice. It came from inside the room, soft but crystalline, each word articulated with the kind of strength that didn't need volume. She was speaking to her father, Something about bills and insurance, her tone determinedly cheerful despite the weight of the words. Adrian's hand remained frozen on the door handle, and for reasons he couldn't explain, his heart began to beat faster. When he finally entered, the room seemed to contract around her. Selena Metz stood by the window, late afternoon light turning her hair to dark honey. She wore simple clothes, jeans, a worn sweater, but carried herself with a dignity that made his expensive suit feel like costume jewelry. Her face was lovely in an unconventional way, all sharp intelligence and soft mouth, eyes the color of amber that widened when they landed on him. She didn't bow, didn't curtsy, didn't even look away. Instead, she stepped forward, placing herself between Adrian and her sleeping father, and the movement was so instinctively protective that something twisted in Adrian's chest. Prince Adrian. His title sounded like an accusation in her mouth. How gracious of you to visit the man whose life you destroyed. Her father stirred in his sleep, and she lowered her voice, but the fury in it only concentrated became more potent. Adrian had faced down hostile diplomats, ruthless competitors, his own father's legendary rage. None of it had prepared him for the way this woman's contempt made his throat tighten. I came to ensure he receives the best care, Adrian said, and his voice sounded hollow even to himself. We don't need your care. She moved closer, and he caught the scent of hospital soap and something underneath it. Something warm and utterly her. His pulse kicked. We needed his job, his dignity, the security you ripped away because you've spent so long looking down from your throne that you've forgotten real people exist below it. She was close enough now that he could see the shadows under her eyes, the exhaustion she wore like armor, close enough that when she spoke again, her words landed like physical blows. My father gave 27 years to your family's company. 27 years of loyalty, of dedication, of believing that hard work mattered. And you discarded him like he was nothing. Because to you, he is nothing. We all are. Adrian opened his mouth, though he had no idea what words might form. An apology? A justification? But Celine turned away before he could speak, returning to her father's bedside, dismissing him more effectively than any command he'd ever given. He left without another word, his footsteps too loud in the quiet corridor, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm he didn't recognize. That night, he sat in his study and did something he'd never done before. He researched her. Not with investigators or palace resources, just simple searches that revealed a woman who'd put herself through university while working 2 jobs, who volunteered at women's shelters, who had turned down a prestigious job overseas to stay close to her widowed father. Everything Adrian had never been. Selfless, grounded, real. 3 days later, he sent a discreet envelope to her address, enough money to cover months of expenses, sent through channels that couldn't be traced back to him directly. He told himself it was duty, not guilt. Certainly not the desperate need to ease the disappointment he'd seen in her amber eyes. The envelope returned within 24 hours. Inside, written in elegant script on the palace's own letterhead, were 8 words that would haunt him. We don't need your guilt money. Sam Adrian stood in his office, the note in his fingers, and felt something he'd thought himself incapable of feeling. Shame so profound it stole his breath. And beneath that shame, growing like a seed in poisoned soil, was something infinitely more dangerous. Fascination. The weeks that followed were an exercise in Adrian's unraveling. He told himself he was simply monitoring Richard Metz's recovery, a reasonable precaution for potential liability. He certainly wasn't manufacturing excuses to receive updates about the man's condition. He definitely wasn't timing his afternoon calls to his secretary to coincide with hospital visiting hours, listening with inexplicable intensity as she relayed that the daughter visited every day without fail, that she'd taken a leave of absence from her teaching position, that she was exhausting herself caring for her father. He absolutely wasn't thinking about her, except he thought about nothing else. In board meetings, he'd lose the thread of conversation, his mind conjuring the way sunlight had caught in Celine's hair, the protective fury in her stance. During diplomatic dinners, he'd find himself wondering what she was doing at that exact moment. Reading to her father, perhaps, her voice soft with the tenderness she'd never show him. At night, alone in rooms designed to showcase power. He'd remember the contempt in her eyes, and feel something that might have been longing if he'd known what longing felt like. It was madness. He knew it was madness, but knowing didn't stop him from returning to the hospital. He went under the pretense of visiting other patients, a charity initiative his assistant quickly arranged. Bewildered by this sudden interest in public engagement, Adrian moved through the wards with his usual controlled grace, shaking hands, offering measured words of comfort, all while his awareness extended like a radar seeking a single signal. He found her in the lobby on a Thursday afternoon, standing by the coffee machine with her eyes closed and her hand pressed against the wall, as if it were the only thing holding her upright. She wore the same worn sweater, and there were new shadows under her eyes, and Adrian felt his chest constrict with an emotion he refused to name. He started toward her without thinking, drawn by an instinct that overrode years of calculated behavior. She opened her eyes, saw him, and walked away. Not hurriedly, not dramatically. That would have suggested he mattered enough to provoke reaction. Instead, she simply turned and moved toward the elevators as if he were invisible, as if the prince who made nations nervous was nothing more than air. Adrian stopped mid-stride, frozen in the middle of the lobby, aware of the security detail hovering uncertainly behind him, of the hospital staff beginning to notice and stare. He should have continued with his scheduled visits, should have dismissed her rudeness with the cold detachment that came so naturally. Instead, he stood there like a fool, watching her disappear behind closing elevator doors, and felt the absence like a physical ache. The gifts started after that. He told himself they were anonymous, though he knew she'd see through the pretense. Flowers delivered to her apartment, expensive arrangements that came back the next day, untouched. A signed grant ensuring her father's medical expenses would be covered, returned with a curt note from hospital administration stating the family had declined. Books he'd noticed on her wish list from an old social media profile he definitely shouldn't have found, all sent back unopened. Each rejection should have stopped him. Each one only made the compulsion worse. His assistant began giving him worried looks. His secretary asked with uncharacteristic boldness if everything was all right. Adrian assured them with his customary cold authority that he was perfectly fine, then spent that evening composing and deleting 17 different letters of apology he'd never send. It was on a late-night visit to the hospital, ostensibly to review the new pediatric wing funding, that he finally heard her voice again. He was in a quiet corridor, reviewing documents with the hospital administrator, when Celine's words drifted from around the corner where she sat with another visitor. "I hope," she was saying, her voice carrying that same crystalline quality that haunted his dreams, "that someday he feels what it's like, to lose everything that matters, to have someone with power look at you and decide you're disposable. I hope he stays awake at night wondering if he's the villain in someone else's story." A pause. Then, softer, almost broken. "I hope it hurts." The administrator was still speaking, pointing out architectural features Adrian didn't see. He nodded automatically, his mind white noise, his chest tight with something that might have been pain if he'd allowed himself to feel pain. That night, alone in his study with the city glittering below, Adrian Van Cleese pressed his palm against the window glass and finally admitted what he'd been running from. He didn't just feel guilty, he was falling. And the woman he was falling for wished him nothing but suffering. The Asterian Children's Fund Gala was the social event of the season, an evening where old money mingled with new, where diplomatic alliances were forged over champagne, where Adrian had spent the last decade playing his role with perfect practiced grace. He'd planned to attend for exactly 90 minutes, make his obligatory speech, and return to the solitude of his study, where he could continue the exquisite torture of not thinking about Celine Metz. Then he saw her across the ballroom, and every carefully constructed plan dissolved into irrelevance. She was volunteering at the registration desk, managing the organized chaos of arrivals with efficient grace. Her hair was pulled back, revealing the elegant line of her neck. She wore a simple black dress borrowed from somewhere. He could tell by the way it fit almost, but not quite right. And she was more beautiful than every jeweled socialite in the room. Adrian stopped breathing. He'd planned his entrance perfectly as always. Time to maximize impact, minimize mingling. But now he stood frozen at the top of the grand staircase while his mind short-circuited, awareness narrowing to her with such intensity that the crowd seemed to fade into watercolor background. She was smiling at an elderly guest, her expression so warm it transformed her face, and Adrian felt something savage twist in his chest at the realization that she'd never smiled at him that way, that she never would. He descended the stairs through sheer force of will, accepting greetings he didn't hear, shaking hands he didn't feel. His security detail moved with him, but their presence barely registered. Everything in him was attuned to her, the way she moved, the sound of her voice, the magnetic pull that seemed to strengthen with proximity until standing on the opposite side of the room felt like standing in the wrong hemisphere. He was staring. He knew he was staring. Several guests had noticed, their whispers beginning to circulate with the champagne. Adrian didn't care. Then she looked up. Their eyes met across the ballroom, and he watched her entire body stiffen. The smile vanished from her face, replaced by something between recognition and revulsion. She said something to the volunteer beside her and started to turn away, that same dismissal that hollowed him out every time. Adrian moved without thinking. He crossed the ballroom with speed that bordered on improper, ignoring protocol, ignoring the surprised faces of guests forced to step aside. His security detail struggled to keep pace. He heard his name called twice, once by a diplomat, once by his own assistant, but his focus had narrowed to singular purpose. He reached the registration desk just as Selena was stepping away. "Miss Metz." She stopped, every line of her body rigid with tension, and slowly turned to face him. Up close, he could see the fire in her amber eyes, the way her hands clenched at her sides. Could see, too, the exhaustion still haunting her features, the burden she carried that he'd helped place on her shoulders. "Your Highness." The words were ice. "How lovely to see you playing the benevolent prince. Is this where you pretend you care about children while destroying families in your spare time?" The guest near enough to hear gasped. Someone's champagne glass hit the floor. Adrian's security detail tensed, moving closer, but he waved them back with a subtle gesture. "Celine, don't." Her voice shook now, control fracturing. "Don't you dare speak my name like you know me, like you have any right to familiarity. You're here for photographs and tax benefits, not because you actually care about anyone in this room. You're exactly what I thought you were. A man who's so high above humanity that he's forgotten how to be human." Every word landed like a blade between his ribs. Adrian was aware of the crowd growing around them, of phones being raised, of the scandal that would dominate tomorrow's headlines. None of it mattered. What mattered was the betrayed fury in her eyes, the pain underneath it that he'd caused. What mattered was that she was right. "You're correct," he said quietly, and the surrounding crowd went utterly silent. "I forgot. I've been forgetting for years. I became exactly what I was trained to be, efficient, ruthless, disconnected. I made decisions based on numbers rather than lives. I hurt your father. I hurt you, and no amount of charity galas or hospital wings can erase that." Celine's eyes widened slightly, clearly unprepared for agreement. Adrian took a breath that felt like inhaling glass. "I am sorry, Miss Metz, not because I got caught, not for appearances. I am deeply, profoundly sorry for what I did to your father, to your family, to you." The silence stretched, taut as a wire. Somewhere in the background, a photographer's shutter clicked repeatedly. Adrian ignored it all, his entire world reduced to the woman before him and the judgment in her eyes. "Sorry doesn't fix anything," she whispered finally. "Sorry doesn't give him back his dignity. Doesn't erase the stress that nearly killed him. Doesn't undo the damage you caused because you were too arrogant to see him as a person." She turned then, walking toward the exit with her head high despite the way her hands trembled. Adrian watched her go, every instinct screaming at him to follow, knowing he had no right. Behind him, the whispers crescendoed. His assistant materialized at his elbow, stress radiating from every pore, already calculating damage control. But Adrian stood motionless in the center of the ballroom, his chest tight with a realization that rewrote everything he thought he understood about himself. He wasn't trying to fix his mistake anymore. He was trying to win her. To earn something from her besides contempt, and he had absolutely no idea how. The scandal broke before midnight. Prince Adrian's public apology, heartfelt or hollow. Royal confrontation, commoner calls out, Crown Prince, is the ruthless prince. Finally human? Adrian ignored them all. He had more important concerns. He returned to Asterian General the next morning, but not as a prince making a diplomatic visit. He came early before the press could follow. Came in clothes his assistant had stared at in open shock. Simple slacks, an ordinary shirt. Nothing that announced his status. Came with the intention of doing something he'd never done in his life. Helping. The volunteer coordinator eyed him with undisguised suspicion when he appeared at her desk. He didn't blame her. Princes didn't volunteer. They donated. They attended photo opportunities. They certainly didn't show up asking to clean bedpans or deliver meal trays. But Adrian was done with photo opportunities. He started in the pediatric wing, reading to children whose parents were working. Moved to the general ward, helping nurses change bedding, refill water pitchers, adjust curtains for patients too weak to reach. He fetched forgotten items from the gift shop. He sat with an elderly man who had no visitors and listened to stories about a war Adrian had only read about in history. Books. The work was humbling, exhausting, real. In a way, his life had never been real, and she noticed he felt Celine's presence before he saw her, that same magnetic awareness that had been haunting him for weeks. She stood in the doorway of the ward, watching him adjust an IV stand under a nurse's patient instruction, her expression unreadable. Their eyes met, held. Then she turned and walked away. But she didn't disappear. She stayed in the hospital, moving through her own routines, and Adrian was achingly conscious of her, the sound of her voice in another room, the glimpse of her passing in the corridor, the way the air seemed to shift when she was near. He returned the next day. And the next? A week passed, then 2. His assistant rearranged his schedule with increasing creativity. His secretary stopped asking questions. The hospital staff gradually accepted his presence, though they never quite stopped being surprised. Adrian learned the names of patients, learned their stories, their fears, their small victories, learned that power meant nothing compared to the quiet dignity of suffering faced with courage, learned that he'd been wrong about nearly everything he'd built his identity upon. It was on a rainy Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks into this new routine, that Celine finally spoke to him. He was in the hallway, delivering fresh towels to a patient's room, when her voice stopped him cold. Why? One word, but it carried the weight of every question she hadn't asked. Adrian turned slowly, towels still clutched in his hands like a shield, to find her standing 5 feet away with her arms crossed and her amber eyes searching his face for lies. Why are you here? She pressed. The press stopped covering it after the first week. You got your redemption story, so why are you still here? Doing actual work instead of just posing for photographs. Adrian's throat went dry. He'd prepared for this conversation in his mind 100 times, rehearsed responses that were eloquent and measured. Now, faced with her direct gaze, all those careful words evaporated. Because you were right, he said simply. I forgot how to be human. This is me trying to remember. You can't fix what you did by playing nurse. Her voice was sharp, but something flickered in her eyes. Something that might have been the first crack in her armor. I know. He set the towels down on a nearby cart, his hands suddenly needing something to do. I can't give back what I took from your father. I can't undo the stress, the fear, the loss of security. I can't make you stop hating me, and I don't deserve to try. Then why? Because it matters anyway. The words came raw, unpolished. Because I need to be better than I was, regardless of whether you ever forgive me. Because for the first time in my life, I care about something more than power or efficiency or the bottom line. Celine stared at him, and Adrian felt stripped bare under that gaze, every defense he'd ever constructed crumbling to dust. His heart hammered. His palms were sweating, an impossibility for someone trained from birth in composure. But standing before her, he felt like a boy again, uncertain and desperately hopeful in a way that terrified him. You destroyed my father's life, she said quietly, but the anger had leached from her voice, leaving something more painful behind. You can't just volunteer at a hospital and expect that to balance the scales. I know. He'd never meant 2 words more. I don't expect anything from you, Celine. I just needed you to know that I'm trying. He stopped, because the truth lodged in his throat was too dangerous to speak. That he was falling. That he'd been falling since the moment she'd looked at him with contempt instead of awe. That he woke thinking of her, and slept, dreaming of impossible futures where she might look at him without that wall of pain in her eyes. She stood there for a long moment, some war playing out behind her expression. Then she nodded once, tersely, and walked away. That night, Adrian received a call from a nurse he'd befriended that Richard Metz had suffered a sudden blood pressure crisis. Adrian drove through the storm, arriving at the hospital to be there for Celine. He stayed in the ER waiting room through the long hours of the night, hands clasped between his knees, praying for Richard to be okay. When dawn broke gray and cold, and Richard was finally stable, Celine emerged from the treatment area to find him still there. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes red-rimmed, her composure shattered by exhaustion and fear. Adrian's heart ached at the sight of her. If only he could take all her worries away. She looked at him, this prince who'd waited through the night with no cameras to document his sacrifice, and something in her expression shifted. She didn't smile. Didn't speak. Just held his gaze for 3 heartbeats before turning away. But Adrian sat in that uncomfortable plastic chair as the hospital came to life around him, and felt something impossibly fragile unfurl in his chest. Hope. Adrian must have fallen asleep sometime after dawn, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion. He woke to pale sunlight streaming through the waiting room windows, and the peculiar stiffness that came from sleeping upright in a chair designed to be uncomfortable. His neck ached. His mouth tasted like stale coffee. His normally immaculate appearance had devolved into wrinkled clothes and stubble he'd never have allowed to darken his jaw. He'd never cared less about his appearance in his life. Celine stood 10 feet away, watching him with an expression he couldn't read. She held 2 paper cups of coffee, steam rising from the lids, and there were new shadows under her eyes that made his chest ache. He wondered how long she'd been standing there, whether she'd seen him in this undone state, whether it mattered. Everything mattered with her. That was the problem. He's stable, she said quietly. Sleeping. Adrian stood, wincing as his spine protested. I'm glad. She moved closer, extending one of the coffee cups. He took it, their fingers brushing for half a heartbeat, and the contact sent electricity racing up his arm, with an intensity that would have embarrassed him if he had any pride left to bruise. He didn't. She'd stripped that from him weeks ago. They stood in silence, sipping terrible hospital coffee while early morning light painted everything gold. Adrian was intensely aware of her proximity, close enough that he could see the exhaustion etched into her features, the way her hands trembled slightly from stress and sleeplessness. Close enough that he could smell her shampoo, something simple and clean that had no right to make his heart race this way. You stayed all night. It wasn't quite a question. Yes. Why? Because the thought of you facing this alone was unbearable. Because I'd wait 100 nights if it meant easing your burden by a fraction. Because I'm falling so hard I can't remember what solid ground felt like. It seemed important, he said instead, and hated himself for the cowardice. Celine studied him over the rim of her coffee cup, amber eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him feel transparent. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? A monster. She said it simply, without malice. Someone incapable of feeling. But you're here, unshaven and sleeping in plastic chairs, and I don't... She stopped, frustration flickering across her features. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it. The words came roughly. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Celine. I know I don't deserve it. I'm not asking for anything, liar, his heart whispered. You're asking for everything. She set her coffee down on the side table, wrapping her arms around herself as if suddenly cold. I wanted to hate you. It was easier when I could hate you. When you were just this figure of cold authority who destroyed lives without thought. But then you kept showing up, Kept trying. And now she broke off, turning toward the window. Adrian's pulse hammered in his throat. He wanted to close the distance between them. Wanted it with a desperation that frightened him. Instead, he remained frozen, giving her space, waiting for whatever verdict she was formulating. "My father asked about you this morning," she said finally, before they sedated him. "He wanted to know if you were still here." Adrian's throat tightened. "What did you tell him?" "The truth." She looked back at him, and there was something new in her expression, something softer than contempt, but more dangerous than acceptance. "That you've been here every day for 3 weeks. That you've learned the names of every patient on his floor. That you've been—" her voice caught. "That you've been human." The silence stretched between them, taut with things unsaid. Adrian gripped his coffee cup harder, using the pain of too hot cardboard to anchor himself. "I should let you rest," he said, though leaving felt like tearing out his own lungs. "You've been up all night. You need— stay." One word, barely a whisper, but it stopped him mid-turn. "Please," Celine added, and the exhaustion in her voice unmade him. "I don't want to be alone right now. And you've been here this long anyway." So he stayed. They sat in the uncomfortable chairs as the hospital woke around them. Celine told him about her father. Not the broken man Adrian had fired, but the person before. The man who'd taught her to ride a bike, who'd worked 2 jobs after her mother died to keep her in a good school, who'd believed so completely in the value of hard work and integrity. Adrian listened. Each story another weight added to the guilt he carried. But he listened because she needed to speak, because her voice was the only thing in the world that mattered. Somewhere around mid-morning, she fell asleep mid-sentence, her head tipping sideways. Without thinking, Adrian reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder before carefully, reverently guiding her head to rest against his arm. She didn't wake, just settled against him with a small sigh, her exhaustion finally claiming her. Adrian sat motionless, barely breathing, terrified of disturbing her. His arm would go numb, his back would protest. None of it registered beyond the profound rightness of her weight against him, the trust implicit in her unconscious surrender. 2 nurses passed and smiled knowingly. A doctor gave him a subtle nod of approval. Adrian didn't care. He would sit here until his muscles atrophied if it meant she could rest. It was another hour before she stirred, blinking awake with confusion that melted into mortification when she realized she'd been leaning against him. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "Don't apologize." His voice came rough from disuse. "You needed to rest." She sat up, putting careful distance between them, and Adrian felt the loss of her warmth like a physical wound. Something had shifted between them in the quiet morning hours, some wall beginning to crack. But he didn't know how fragile it was, didn't dare push. "I should go home," she said, not meeting his eyes. "Shower, change, I'll be back this afternoon." Adrian nodded, standing when she did. Professional distance reasserting itself even as everything in him screamed to close the gap. "Celine." She paused at the doorway, looking back. "If my presence makes this harder for you," he said carefully. "If it adds to your burden instead of easing it, tell me. I'll leave. I'll stay away completely. Your peace matters more than—" He stopped before he could say something unforgivable. More than anything. For a long moment she just looked at him, something complicated moving behind her eyes. Then she did something that stopped his heart entirely. She almost smiled. Not quite, just the faintest softening at the corners of her mouth, but it hit him with the force of a lightning strike. "I'll see you this afternoon." "Your Highness." She left, and Adrian stood in the empty waiting room with his heart racing, his throat dry, his carefully constructed composure in ruins. He pressed his hand against his chest as if he could physically slow the hammering there, as if he could contain the feeling spreading through him like fire. He was past falling now. He'd already fallen, and the impact would destroy him. The photographs hit social media first, then mainstream news within hours. Prince Adrian sleeping in a hospital chair, disheveled and unguarded. Prince Adrian carrying towels through hospital corridors. Prince Adrian deep in conversation with an unremarkable woman in a worn sweater. But it was the photograph from the waiting room that went viral. The one capturing Celine asleep against his shoulder. His expression unguarded, vulnerable in a way the public had never seen. Someone had captioned it. The Prince and the Commoner. A modern fairy tale? The tabloids were less generous. Royal obsession, Prince's fixation on teacher raises. Concerns, from firing to flirting. Inside Adrian's redemption, romance palace sources worry. Over Prince's mental state, Adrian watched his carefully constructed reputation disintegrate with detached fascination. His advisors panicked. His father called from the palace with barely controlled fury. The board of directors requested an emergency meeting to discuss his erratic behavior and compromise judgment. He ignored them all. Because 3 days after the photographs broke, Celine stopped coming to the hospital. Richard had been moved to a standard room, his condition improving steadily. The nurses confirmed he'd had visitors. His brother, some friends from church. But not his daughter. Adrian told himself there were reasonable explanations. She'd needed rest. She'd returned to work. She was simply taking a break from the exhausting routine. He knew he was lying. On the 4th day of her absence, he couldn't bear it anymore. He went to her apartment, a modest building in a decent neighborhood, the kind of place he'd never have noticed in his previous life. Stood outside in the evening chill, staring up at windows that showed no lights, and felt the full weight of what he'd done. The press had found her. He'd seen the articles, reporters camping outside her building, digging into her past, analyzing her clothes, her job, her relationship history. They'd interviewed her neighbors, her colleagues, her former students. They'd turned her into a character in a story she'd never asked to be part of. He'd destroyed her peace again. This time with attention instead of cruelty, but the damage was the same. Adrian was turning to leave when her voice stopped him. "You have some nerve." She stood at the building's entrance, groceries in hand, face illuminated by the harsh glow of a streetlight. The exhaustion in her eyes had transformed into something sharper, more dangerous. Fury wrapped in barely controlled composure. "Celine, do you know what the past 4 days have been like?" She moved toward him, and he instinctively stepped back, struck by the force of her anger. Reporters at my door at 6 a.m. Photographers following me to work. Strangers analyzing every aspect of my life online. My students asking if I'm dating a prince. My father fielding calls from gossip magazines. You never want anything, do you? You just act, and the rest of us deal with the consequences. She set her groceries down on the steps with controlled fury. First, you fired my father without thought for the devastation it would cause. Then you decided to play at redemption, showing up at the hospital like some kind of savior. And now you've made me into tabloid fodder. The poor commoner who caught the broken prince's eye. The redemption romance. The modern fairy tale. Each word landed like a physical blow. Adrian stood motionless, accepting every hit, because she was right. She'd always been right. "I came to apologize," he said quietly. "Another apology." Her laugh was bitter. "How many does that make now? 5? 6? At what point do your apologies become just another form of violence?" The truth of it staggered him. He'd been so focused on his own need for redemption that he'd never considered he might be hurting her in entirely new ways. That his presence, his attention, his desperate need to be better might be just another burden she hadn't asked to carry. "You're right," he said, and his voice came out raw, stripped. "Everything you've said, you're right. I've been selfish from the beginning. Selfish when I fired your father. Selfish in my attempts to make amends. Selfish in my need to be near you. I've ruined your reputation, invaded your peace, made you a spectacle. And he stopped, because the truth pressed against his teeth, demanding release. Because he was tired of hiding behind careful words and measured responses. Because if he was going to lose her, and he was, he could see it in the rigid set of her shoulders. Then at least he'd lose her honestly. "I've fallen in love with you," he said, and the words fell like stones into water, creating ripples he couldn't control. "Desperately, completely, impossibly in love with you." And that's not your problem to solve or your burden to carry. It's mine. So I'll go. I'll issue a statement that we're not involved, that the photographs were misinterpreted. I'll make sure the press leaves you alone. I'll disappear from your life entirely if that's what you need." Celine stared at him, something between shock and fury warring in her expression. The streetlight cast harsh shadows across her face, and Adrian memorized every angle, knowing it might be the last time he stood this close to her. "You love me," she repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the words. "Yes. The man who destroyed my father's life, who represents everything I've spent my life fighting against. Privilege without responsibility, power without empathy, wealth without compassion. Yes." The admission tasted like ash. "And you think that matters? You think love excuses what you've done? Redeems it somehow?" "No." He took a step back, creating distance because standing near her while she looked at him like that was agony. "Love doesn't excuse anything, it just is. And it's the reason I have to leave. Because loving you means putting your well-being above my own needs. It means stopping before I cause more damage." The rain that had been threatening all evening finally broke. Cold drops hitting the pavement with increasing intensity. Adrian turned to go, his heart a dead weight in his chest. "Wait." He froze, hope and fear warring in equal measure. Celine stood in the rain, letting it soak her hair, run down her face. "You think you love me," she said, her voice shaking. "But you don't even know me. You know a character you've built in your head, the woman who put you in your place, who challenged your worldview. You're in love with your own transformation, not with me. You're wrong." The words came fierce, unplanned. "I know you volunteer at St. Catherine's Women's Shelter every Saturday. I know you're terrified of hospitals but spend every free moment in one for your father. I know you turned down a position at the Merrill Academy because they wanted you to focus on wealthy students, and you believed every child deserved access to quality education. I know you read poetry before bed and cry at movies you claim are stupid and take your coffee with too much sugar and not enough cream." Her eyes widened with each detail, the rain plastering her hair to her face. "I know you carry other people's pain like it's your own," Adrian continued, his voice rough with emotion he'd stopped trying to contain. "That you give everything and ask for nothing. That you're the strongest person I've ever met, and also somehow the gentlest. I know that when you smile, really smile, not the polite version, it transforms your entire face, and it takes my breath away. And I know I don't deserve a single second of your time, but that doesn't make any of this less real." The rain fell harder. Neither of them moved. "This is insane," Celine whispered. "This whole thing is insane." "I know. You've known me for weeks." "Weeks, Adrian. People don't fall in love in weeks. I did. Simple. Undeniable." "True." She shook her head, backing toward her building. I can't do this. The press, the attention, the impossible situation of caring about someone who hurt my family. I can't carry this too." "I know." He stayed where he was, rain soaking through his expensive coat, his heart fracturing with each word. "That's why I'm leaving. That's why I'll make sure the press stops harassing you. That's why I'll stay away from the hospital, from you, from any place where my presence causes harm." "You're leaving," she repeated. "If that's what you want." Celine stood on the steps of her building, rain streaming down her face, her eyes bright with something that might have been tears or might have been rain. "What I want," she said slowly, "is for you to stop making decisions for me. Stop trying to manage my life, control the narrative, fix everything. What I want is for you to ask me what I want, instead of assuming you know." Adrian's heart stuttered. "What do you want, Celine?" The silence stretched, punctuated only by rain and the distant sound of traffic. She looked at him, really looked, as if seeing him for the first time. And something in her expression shifted. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I'm so angry with you. For what you did to my father, for the media circus, for making me feel..." She stopped, wrapped her arms around herself. "I don't know what I want, but I know I'm not ready to watch you walk away without understanding what that means." "It means your peace," Adrian said quietly. "Your life back. No more photographers, no more scandal, no more guilt by association." "It means I'll wonder," she countered. "Wonder if you meant any of it. If the man who stayed up all night in that hospital chair was real or just another performance. Wonder if I'm making the same mistake my father made, believing in someone who will ultimately prove I was a fool. The words hit harder than any accusation. Adrian stood in the rain, his composure shattered, his heart exposed. I was real, he said hoarsely. Every moment with you has been the only real thing in my life. Celine wiped rain from her face with a shaking hand. Then give me time. Give me space to figure out what I feel without the pressure of your presence or your absence. Let me make this decision without you trying to orchestrate the outcome. How long? I don't know. She picked up her groceries, exhaustion etched into every line of her body. But if you mean what you say, if you really love me, then you'll trust me to come to my own conclusions. She disappeared into her building, leaving Adrian standing in the rain with his heart pounding and his throat tight with words he hadn't spoken. He should have felt relief. She hadn't told him to leave forever. But all he felt was the aching absence of her, the uncertainty of waiting, the fear that when she finally decided, the answer would destroy him. He stood there for a long time, rain soaking him to the bone, and whispered to the empty street, "If love is my punishment, I'll serve it gladly." Then he walked away, leaving behind the only thing that had ever mattered. Three weeks passed like years. Adrian kept his word, issued a statement through official channels that the photographs had been misinterpreted, that Miss Metz was the daughter of a former employee he'd wronged, and he'd been attempting to make amends. The palace PR team spun it as the prince taking personal responsibility for his past mistakes. The press, sensing the story had lost its romance, largely moved on to other scandals. Adrian moved through his days like a ghost. He attended meetings without absorbing a word, signed documents he didn't read, made decisions his advisors later had to quietly reverse. At night, he stood at his study window watching the city below and wondered if she was looking at the same sky, feeling the same impossible ache. He didn't go to the hospital, didn't drive past her apartment, didn't manufacture excuses to check on Richard's recovery. He'd promised her space, and he would give it even if the absence carved him hollow. His assistant worried. His secretary brought him coffee he didn't drink. His father called from the palace and said, with unusual gentleness, "Whatever you're doing to yourself, stop." Adrian couldn't explain that stopping would require not loving her, and he'd have better luck stopping his own heartbeat. He lasted 21, days before the storm broke. It started with rain, the kind of freezing autumn downpour that turned the city gray and sent people scurrying for shelter. Adrian worked late, as he did every night now, using exhaustion as anesthesia. His assistant had gone home hours ago. The building sat empty except for night security and cleaning staff. He tried to focus on quarterly projections. Reviewed merger documents that might as well have been written in another language. It didn't help that he hadn't eaten in 4 days. Finally admitted defeat and pulled up his phone, scrolling to her contact. Still saved, though he'd never used it to call. Celine had given him her number weeks ago for hospital updates about her father. He stared at it now, his thumb hovering over the screen. 3 weeks was enough time, wasn't it? Enough space? Or was he being selfish again, measuring her healing by his own desperation? He stood abruptly, grabbed his coat, and walked out into the storm. Adrian didn't plan where he was going, didn't consciously choose the route. But his feet knew the way to her apartment, had mapped it into muscle memory from the single time he'd stood outside. The rain intensified as he drove, his security detail following at a discreet distance. He sent them away when he parked. Whatever he was about to do, he'd do it without witnesses. Her building looked different in the storm. Smaller, more vulnerable. Lights glowed in some windows, including hers on the 3rd floor. She was home, awake, living her life in the space he'd given her. Adrian stood on the sidewalk in the freezing rain, his coat quickly soaking through, and admitted what he'd been avoiding for 3 weeks. He couldn't do this, couldn't exist in a world where she wasn't part of his daily reality, couldn't breathe properly without knowing if she was all right, if she was happy, if there was any chance. He walked to her building entrance and pressed the buzzer. No answer. He tried again, rain streaming down his face, into his eyes, soaking through his clothes to his skin. The cold bit deep, but he barely felt it. Everything had narrowed to the buzzer button and the possibility of her voice through the intercom. Still nothing. Adrian stepped back, tilting his head up toward her window. He could see her silhouette moving past the curtains. She was there. She'd heard the buzzer. She'd chosen not to answer. The message was clear. He should leave. Should respect the boundary she was drawing. Instead, he sank to his knees on the wet pavement. The cold was immediate and brutal, rain soaking through his pants, pavement ice against his legs. Adrian stayed down, his hands loose at his sides, his head bowed. Not a performance, not a gesture calculated to manipulate, just the physical manifestation of a truth he could no longer contain. He was done pretending he could survive without her. The rain fell harder. His teeth began to chatter. Time became meaningless. Minutes or hours, he couldn't tell. His security detail had probably sent worried messages. His assistant would have alerted the palace. Somewhere, people were panicking about the crown prince kneeling in the rain like a madman. Adrian didn't care. His voice, when it came, was rough with cold and emotion. "I destroyed your peace once," he said to the closed door, to Celine, who might be listening. "Don't make me live without you now." More silence, more rain. The cold had progressed from uncomfortable to painful, his body beginning to shake with it. His mind grew fuzzy at the edges, thoughts fragmenting. He didn't know when the door above opened. Didn't hear her footsteps on the stairs. Didn't realize she was there until her voice cut through the storm. Adrian. His name on her lips, soft with horror. He tried to look up, but his muscles wouldn't cooperate properly. Everything had gone numb, the cold finally winning the battle. He saw her shoes, water-damaged leather, then her hands reaching for him. "What are you?" Her voice broke. "How long have you been out here?" He couldn't remember, couldn't form words through the chattering of his teeth, could only look at her face, rain-streaked and beautiful, and think that if he died here, at least the last thing he'd see was her. "Get up," she demanded, trying to pull him to his feet. "Adrian, get up right now!" His legs buckled. The world tilted sideways. He felt her arms around him, far too small to support his weight, but trying anyway, her voice rising with panic. "Help! Someone help me!" Doors opened. Voices called out. Hands, multiple hands lifting him. The warmth of a building interior hit like a shock, making the cold worse before it got better. He was being dragged, carried, voices overlapping with concern and confusion. Then Celine's face, inches from his, her hands cupping his frozen face. "Don't you dare!" she said fiercely. "Don't you dare do this. Stay awake. Stay with me." He wanted to tell her he'd stay anywhere she was, wanted to apologize for scaring her, wanted to say so many things. Instead, his eyes closed, and he fell into darkness with her voice calling him back. Adrian woke to warmth. Not the impersonal warmth of hospital heating, but something more intimate. Thick blankets, a soft surface beneath him, the muted sounds of a small space. He opened his eyes slowly, his body aching with the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd pushed too far. Celine's apartment. He was in Celine's apartment. Memory flooded back, the rain, the kneeling, the cold that had seeped into his marrow. He turned his head, wincing at the stiffness, and found her curled in an armchair beside the couch he occupied. She was wrapped in an oversized cardigan, her hair still damp from the rain, eyes closed in uneasy sleep. Even now, exhausted and worried, she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. He must have made a sound, because her eyes flew open, immediately alert. She unfolded from the chair with the quick grace of someone who'd been sleeping lightly, waiting. Her hand reached for his forehead, checking for fever, he realized, and the touch of her palm against his skin sent awareness cascading through him. "You're an idiot," she said, and her voice shook. "A complete, impossible idiot. I know." His throat was raw from the cold. "I'm sorry. She pulled her hand back, wrapping her arms around herself. "You could have died, Adrian. Hypothermia, pneumonia. Do you understand that? Do you grasp what you almost did? He pushed himself up to sitting, ignoring his body's protests. I understand. Do you? Because I found you collapsed in the rain, barely conscious, after God knows how long you'd been kneeling out there like some kind of... Her voice cracked. She turned away, pressing her fingers to her eyes. Adrian watched her shoulders shake and felt his heart fracture. Why did you come down? He asked quietly. You didn't answer the buzzer. You could have called someone else, let them handle it. Why did you open the door? Celine was silent for a long moment, her back still to him. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Because I looked out the window and saw you on your knees. Because even angry, even scared, even determined to protect myself, I couldn't leave you there. You should have. The words tore from somewhere deep. You should have let me face the consequences of my own choices. Should have protected yourself the way I've consistently failed to protect you. Stop. She turned back to him, eyes bright with tears she wouldn't shed. Stop trying to decide what I should or shouldn't do. Stop trying to manage this, control it, fix it. I'm not trying to... You are. She moved closer, each step deliberate. You're still trying to orchestrate the outcome. Kneeling in the rain like some tragic hero, forcing my hand by putting yourself in danger. Did you think I'd see you suffering and just surrender? That fear would accomplish what your apologies couldn't? The accusation hit like ice water. Adrian stared at her, horror blooming in his chest. No. God no, Celine, I never... He stopped, forced himself to really examine his actions. Had he? Had some part of him calculated that putting himself at risk would break through her defenses? I don't know, he admitted finally, the words ashes in his mouth. I want to say no, that I went there just to see your building, to feel closer to you. That the kneeling wasn't planned, that I just broke. But I don't trust my own motivations anymore. Everything I've done has hurt you somehow. Maybe this was just another flavor of manipulation. Celine sank onto the couch beside him, close but not touching, her expression unreadable. Do you want to know what I've spent 3 weeks doing? Yes. Trying to untangle what I feel from what I should feel. Trying to separate the man in the hospital chair from the man who fired my father. Trying to decide if falling for someone who hurt my family makes me weak, or human, or just foolish. She looked at him then. Really looked. And he felt stripped bare. I talked to my father. Did you know that? Adrian's heart stuttered. What did he say? That you've been sending anonymous donations to his medical expenses, routed through 3 different charities so we wouldn't know they came from you. That you arranged a consulting position for him once he recovers. Something flexible that won't stress his heart. That you wrote him a letter he's read so many times the paper's falling apart. He wasn't supposed to know any of that was from me, Adrian said roughly. The donations, the job, I routed them specifically so you wouldn't feel obligated or pressured. How did he... Because my father spent 27 years working in finance, Adrian. He knows how to follow money trails. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. And because the letter came with your personal seal, signed with your actual name. Not very anonymous. He'd forgotten about the seal. Had been so focused on ensuring the finances were untraceable that he'd signed the apology letter without thinking. What did the letter say? That you were wrong. That no explanation excuses what you did. That he was a man of value who deserved to be treated with dignity, and you failed in every possible way. She paused. That you'd spent your whole life measuring people by numbers on spreadsheets, and meeting me made you realize what a poverty that was. Adrian's throat tightened. He remembered writing that letter at 3 a.m., draft after draft, trying to articulate something he barely understood himself. He forgave you, Celine said softly. 2 weeks ago he told me he'd already forgiven you, said that holding on to anger was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, said you were clearly poisoning yourself enough without his help. He's a better man than I'll ever be. Yes. No hesitation, just honest agreement. But the question isn't whether you measure up to my father, Adrian. It's whether I can trust you with my heart when you've already proven you can destroy someone without blinking. The silence stretched taut between them. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the city washed clean and trembling. Inside, Adrian felt the weight of every decision, every choice, every consequence pressing down until he could barely breathe. "I understand if you can't," he said finally. "I understand if the risk is too great. If what I did to your father created a wound that can't heal. I understand if watching me in pain doesn't change the fundamental fact that I'm still the man who caused yours. Do you?" Celine turned to face him fully. "Do you understand that I've been falling for you despite every reasonable objection? That I've watched you transform from someone I despised into someone I can't stop thinking about? That it terrifies me how much I want to trust you when trust has already been broken?" Adrian's heart stopped, then kicked into a rhythm that felt too fast, too hard. "You're falling for me," he repeated, barely able to process the words. "Don't sound so shocked. You're the one who knelt in freezing rain." Her voice shook with something between laughter and tears. "You're the one who's been showing up every day, doing the work, learning to be human. You think I haven't noticed? You think it doesn't matter that the man I saw in that hospital chair is nothing like the man I met in my father's room? It doesn't excuse— No, it doesn't excuse. But maybe that's not the point." She reached out, her hand hovering near his before finally, tentatively making contact. Her fingers were warm against his cold skin, and Adrian felt the touch everywhere, feeling his body heat up. Maybe the point is that people can change. That someone who is thoughtlessly cruel can learn empathy. That love doesn't always make sense or arrive conveniently or follow the rules we think it should. Adrian stared at their joined hands, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid this moment would shatter if he didn't hold perfectly still. "I'm still angry," Celine continued. "I'm still scared. I still don't know if this is the biggest mistake of my life. But when I saw you collapsed in the rain, when I thought I might lose you before I figured out what I wanted," her voice broke completely. "I realized I'd already decided. I just hadn't admitted it yet." "What did you decide?" The words barely made it past his throat. "That I want to try. Not because you've suffered enough or earned forgiveness or successfully performed redemption, but because the person you're becoming is someone I want to know, someone I already care about far more than is wise." The world condensed to this moment. Her hand in his, her eyes meeting his with terrifying honesty, the possibility hanging between them like dawn light. Adrian had spent years wielding power like a scalpel. Precise, cold, effective. None of it had prepared him for this fragile, impossible gift. "I don't deserve this," he said hoarsely. "I don't deserve you." "Probably not." She smiled, small and tentative but real. "But maybe that's not the point either. Maybe the point is what we do with the chance we're given." Adrian lifted their joined hands, pressed his forehead against her knuckles in a gesture that was prayer and promise and surrender all at once. "If I hurt you again, then I'll leave. And I'll survive. And you'll have to live with that." Her free hand came up to cup his face, gentle despite the steel in her words. "But I'm choosing to believe you won't. I'm choosing to trust the man who sat with my father all night, who learned patients' names, who knelt in the rain because he couldn't bear the distance anymore." "I love you," he said against her hand, the words inadequate for the feeling threatening to split him open. "I love you in ways I don't have language for, in ways I'm still discovering, in ways that terrify me because I finally understand what it means to have everything to lose." "I know." Her thumb brushed across his cheekbone. "You've made that abundantly clear. Dramatic, really. Very princely," he laughed, the sound breaking through the tension, and she laughed too, and suddenly they were both laughing and crying, and neither could tell where one started and the other ended. When the laughter faded, Adrian became aware of how close they were. Close enough that he could count the gold flecks in her amber eyes, could feel the warmth of her breath, could see the exact moment her expression shifted from amusement to something deeper. "I should go," he said, though the words felt like lies. "You need rest. I've already disrupted your life enough tonight." "Adrian?" "Yes." "Stay." The invitation hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning, with possibility, with the terrifying leap of faith they were both taking. Adrian searched her face for doubt, for hesitation, found only tired determination, and something that might, impossibly, be love. "Are you sure?" "No. Honest. Always honest. But I'm sure I want to find out what this becomes. I'm sure that sending you away right now feels wrong. I'm sure that despite every logical objection, I trust you not to take advantage of this." So he stayed. They talked through the night as the city slept around them, about his childhood in a palace that valued power over people, about her mother's death and her father's quiet strength, about fears and hopes and the impossible situation they'd found themselves in. Adrian learned the cadence of her thoughts, the way she viewed the world with empathy he'd never developed, the strength that came from choosing compassion, despite having every reason for bitterness. Dawn found them still on the couch. Celine curled against his side, his arm around her shoulders. The new light was tentative, fragile, painting everything gold. "I should probably get ready for work," she murmured against his chest. "Call in sick," he said, then caught himself. "No, I'm sorry, I'm trying to respect your autonomy while simultaneously wanting to keep you here forever. It's a work in progress." She tilted her head up to look at him, and her smile was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "You're a work in progress, but I think I'm okay with that." They stood together, Adrian's body still protesting the cold from the night before. Celine walked him to the door, and the goodbye felt weighted with newness, with the understanding that everything had shifted. "I'll call you," he said, "if that's all right. Just to talk, to see how you are." "I'd like that." She paused. "And Adrian, next time you want to have a dramatic moment in the rain, maybe try knocking first." He laughed, caught her hand, pressed a kiss to her knuckles that was reverent and restrained. "I make no promises." Outside, the post-storm morning was crystalline and new, the world scrubbed clean. Adrian walked to his car with his heart racing, his throat tight with emotions that felt too large for his chest. Behind him, he felt Celine watching from the window, and he turned to look up at her. She lifted her hand in a small wave, backlit by dawn, and Adrian felt something in him settle into place. Not certainty, they had too much to work through for certainty, but rightness, the sense that despite every mistake, every wound, every obstacle, they'd found their way to something true. He raised his hand in return, then got in the car, and drove toward a palace that had never felt like home. But for the first time in his life, he carried home with him, in the warmth of her hand in his, in the promise of her trust, in the impossible grace of her forgiveness, Prince who'd spent his life ruling from heights untouchable, had finally found his kingdom in the heart of a woman who'd taught him how to kneel, and in that surrender, he'd discovered the only power that ever mattered, the strength to become someone worthy of being loved.